The breaking news today, if you're just joining us, is the Prime Minister's pledge overnight in an article in the Daily Telegraph to put UK troops, boots on the ground in Ukraine to help maintain whatever peace settlement may be negotiated. That was when we came on air, but in the past hour, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has touched down in Saudi Arabia to begin talks with Russia over ending the war with Ukraine.
Well, after appearing to be frozen out of the talks, it's reported that Ukrainian officials are now also arriving in Riyadh. Health Secretary Wes Streeting joins us this morning as the government claims to have delivered on its promise of delivering 2 million more appointments. We will come to that and speak further on that in just a moment. But good morning to you, Wes Streeting. If we can look at the situation in Ukraine to begin with, as that is leading the news. So Keir Starmer has made this announcement. He's willing to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a peace deal. There are real concerns from people over how this will work, what this will mean, the consequences of this. Viewers getting in touch this morning have said, what happens if British troops are attacked? We are then at war. They've also said about, should be using them to protect our borders rather than provoke a war. This is a huge step to be taking, isn't it?
Well, good morning. People should be in no doubt that the front line in Ukraine isn't just the front line for the Ukrainian people, it's the front line for the entire European continent, including Britain. What we've seen is an imperialist, expansionist ruler in Vladimir Putin who threatens our own national security, invade a sovereign country and try and get away with it. And that's why it's so important that, as well as securing an end to this war, we also secure a sustainable, just and lasting peace that guarantees the security for all of us, including Britain's national security.
Are we looking at a stitch-up here between Russia and America that completely excludes the UK and that excludes Europe? And that's why we appear to be running to catch up this morning. You've got the Prime Minister saying, we'll send troops to Ukraine as and when. You've got the talks opening in Paris at very, very short notice. There's a sense, really, that the UK and Europe has been left behind here.
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, President Trump was clear ahead of his inauguration that he wanted to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. American and European leaders were speaking just last week in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, including British meetings with Vice President Vance and other leading figures in the Trump administration. Today, the Prime Minister is going to Paris to meet with European counterparts, and next week he's flying to Washington to meet with President Trump. So there's an awful lot of diplomatic back and forth going on. You referenced just earlier the arrival of a Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh. I think that's a really important development because we've been very clear that there can be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine. So I think what you're seeing is a huge diplomatic effort underway to see if we can bring an end to the war in Ukraine, as well as the Prime Minister and others leading preparation for a scenario where a peace agreement has been achieved, but where we also need to take action to secure our own defence and security and European defence and security to stop President Putin doing anything like this again.
And on that point, though, have we really got the capability to actually do this? Because it could potentially be embarrassing. That's according to the former head of the army, Lord Dannatt. He said our military is too run down to lead a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, and it would potentially be embarrassing to attempt to lead such a mission because of the state of the military. He's pointed out if we deploy 10,000 troops, each rotation for 6 months, that effectively ties up 30 to 40,000 troops. And he says it's just not possible. We haven't got that number. We can't do it, can we?
Well, we don't dispute that our predecessors ran down Britain's armed forces over more than a decade, and we came into government with a commitment to get the UK on a path to 2.5% spending on defence. And in fact, the Prime Minister commissioned George Robertson, who's a former Labour Defence Secretary and a former Secretary General of NATO, to undertake a strategic defence review, and that work is quite well underway. So there's a recognition of the challenge facing our armed forces, much like the rest of everything else that government is responsible for, frankly. But we still have some of the best trained armed force in the world. We have significant capability. And what the Prime Minister is suggesting today isn't Britain acting alone, but in lockstep with our allies. I mean, NATO has been the cornerstone of Britain's defence and security since it was founded by a Labour government in the aftermath of the Second World War. So we've got to act together as NATO to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, to secure not just Ukraine's sovereignty and territory, but to secure European defence and security, including Britain's national security.
One more question before we come. I promise you we'll come on to health next, but one more question. You say, quite rightly, and Sir Keir Starmer writes about this in his article in the Telegraph this morning, that it's absolutely essential that Ukraine is part of the negotiations that resolves this war in Ukraine. But it might not happen that way. It might simply be that Russia and America go ahead by themselves, reach an agreement over and above the heads of the Ukrainians, let alone the rest of Europe. What happens then?
Well, I hope that won't be the scenario. And in fact, as I say, the arrival of a Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh is an encouraging development. That we've been very clear there can be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't think that's the intention of our friends in the United States. And it's really important that we work together as NATO allies to bring an end to this conflict. Okay. So that's
well, I hope you're right.
We'll wait and see how things develop in the coming days. But you can see, and I know you're about to ask me about the NHS. I mean, frankly, I think what today shows is whether it's action to secure Britain's defence abroad or action here at home to tackle the big issues like NHS waiting lists. This is a government that is delivering and getting on with the job, albeit the challenges are enormous.
Yes, and listen, turning to the NHS, it's obviously good news. Over 2 million extra NHS appointments took place between July and November last year. When we look at the waiting lists, though, it's come down marginally, standing at 7.46 million in December. I mean, there's still a huge way to go on this. It has barely made a dent, hasn't it? At the same time, people's lives are on the line. We still hear people waiting in trolleys, in corridors, not being able to get GP appointments, bed blocking, crisis with staffing. There is just so much that's still not working in the NHS.
Absolutely, and I want to say two things, really. The first is that we have delivered that first step we promised to deliver 2 million more appointments a year to cut NHS waiting lists, and we've done it 7 months early. So for all those people out there watching, and there will be many who think that politicians talk a lot and do very little, and that politicians don't stick to our promises, I hope this starts to rebuild your shattered confidence that we are sticking to our promises. So that's the first point. The second point, though, I'm not doing victory laps. The Prime Minister isn't doing victory laps. We know there's a hell of a lot more to do, and you're absolutely right, whether it's the size of the waiting lists, the ambulance response times, the people on trolleys in corridors, or the struggle people have to get a GP or a dentist appointment. There are enormous challenges in the NHS. We've hit the ground running. We are attacking those challenges and seeking to deliver year-on-year improvement. But you won't hear us today going around saying, don't worry, job done. What we are saying today is we've delivered our first step. So a lot done, but a hell of a lot more to do. And I hope it just rebuilds a bit of confidence that we are delivering our promises and that things will get better and brighter days lie ahead.
And what about the pressure on the NHS of immigration, legal and illegal? We see figures just this weekend, very high figures still of people coming across. Hundreds of people crossed over the weekend, and it's February. We aren't even in spring or summer. That's putting immense pressure on the NHS, isn't it?
There's no doubt that net migration is placing real pressure on the NHS. It's a mixed picture because in those figures are also people who are coming to work in our NHS and social care services. So we are, I think, slightly over-reliant on overseas workers to staff our health and care services. And I think it's partly my job to help the Home Secretary reduce those net migration figures. And overall, we're investing in the skills of our nation so we can train up our own people to reduce our reliance on people coming from overseas to fill vacancies. On the question of illegal migration, I mean, in common with other challenges across government, we've made progress in the first 7 months, especially on deportations of people who shouldn't be here. And the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have been working ferociously with our allies across Europe, particularly countries like Italy, where this is also a challenge to start dealing with our border security issues. And just last week, we put legislation through Parliament to set up our secure border commands, which unfortunately the Conservatives and Reform voted against. But we are making progress, and in common with what I said about the NHS, a lot done, a hell of a lot more still to do.
OK. Health Secretary Wes Streeting, thank you for your time this morning.